Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I am Kris Mackowski, and joining me tonight is my ECW co-founder, Chris White, and our good pal, Rob Orrison. And Rob is representing our good friends at Emerging Revolutionary War tonight. And we're here to talk a little bit about Stonewall Jackson. And I figure I'm a Jackson fan. Chris is not necessarily a Jackson fan. Rob is not necessarily a Jackson fan. So this could be dogpile on me night tonight. But we're going to talk a little bit about Stonewall Jackson. It is May, the anniversary of his wounding at Chancellorsville on May 2nd, 1863, and his subsequent death a few days later, May 10th, 1863, as he crossed over the river to rest under the shade of the trees. And Chris, let me just ask you to kind of chime in here. Stonewall Jackson, Chancellorsville, that seems to be the story everybody loves, but is that really the story of Chancellorsville?
James Longstreet for life. That's what I got to say about that. No, it's not. I think it's really unfair to all of the men in the Army Northern Virginia who are not named Stonewall Jackson. I also think it's a disservice to the men of the Army of the Potomac who fought the Army Northern Virginia there. The battle at Chancellorsville, the real battle that takes place, starts on May the 3rd. We have opening actions on May the 1st, which will take place at an area we call the First Days Battlefield. It's out by Lick Run. It's preserved by the American Battlefield Trust today. It's along modern-day Route 3. That battle will set the stage for Stonewall Jackson's flank attack the next day, which is a 12-mile circuitous march, which will carry Jackson's 28,000 men around the front and right flank of the Union Army, where Jackson will then attack from west to the east towards Fredericksburg. At the same time, Robert E. Lee, who I don't think gets enough credit for this battle, is going to be sitting on the far side of what is essentially a salient or a portion of the Union line that protrudes outward. Think of a large pimple. And Jackson and Lee will be between, or will be on either side of the Union Army with the Union Army between them. It's actually a very precarious position for both Jackson and Lee, being that they're outnumbered more than 2-1 at this point. Union Army has about 90,000 men around Chancellorsville. Lee and Jackson maybe can muster 45 to 50,000 around Chancellorsville itself. So you have this story of Jackson making the flank attack, and then you have the story of him being wounded that evening on May 2nd of 1863, which turns the story into one man. And many Civil War buffs, their Civil War ends on the evening of May 2nd or maybe on May 10th when Jackson dies 8 days later. I know a few historians whose Civil War ends right then and there on May 2nd of 1863. But the next day,
that's it.
Yeah, the next day you have 22,000 plus casualties. You're almost at an Antietam level number of casualties. You have Lee, who is going to dislodge the Union Army from their position around Chancellorsville. You have two battles around Fredericksburg, the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, the Battle of Salem Church. So there's 3 battles at Chancellorsville the next day, 22,000 plus casualties. 64 of Lee's 130 regimental commanders go down. I mean, there's so much to this story on May the 3rd and then May the 4th when Lee tries to land that killing blow.
Now, I want to go back to something you said a second ago where Lee doesn't get enough credit for this battle. And Rob, I want to kind of pitch it over to you for a quick second, because when we talked about doing this topic tonight, you said, oh yeah, I want to talk about how Jackson ruins Lee's plans. So you apparently don't think that Lee gets enough credit for this either.
I wouldn't say ruin Lee's plans, but
you did say ruin Lee's plans.
I guess what I would say, well, yeah, maybe I did. I guess I would say, what did Jackson do at Chancellorsville that deserves accolades? He doesn't accomplish the mission given to him. He does collapse that flank, but that's not, as you all know, Lee's ultimate goal in every battle Lee fights is not to gain land, not to just kill the enemy soldiers. It is to destroy that army he's going against. And that did not happen. That did not get accomplished. And even if he wasn't wounded that night, it probably wouldn't have gotten accomplished, because there's no way he's going to move those men in the dark, in the thicket of the wilderness, to cut off any Union troops on this side, on the southern side of the Rappahannock. So, you know, I don't know. There's a lot that goes into moving that many men that far, but much like Longstreet at Shin Ridge here at 2nd Manassas, they get a late start, and there's just not enough daylight to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish that afternoon. So maybe I'm a little harsh in saying he ruined Lee's plan. I'll say he didn't accomplish Lee's plan or Lee's goal. but I don't know what he does at Chancellorsville. And here comes the hate tweets, I'm sure. But I don't know what he does at Chancellorsville that he is so revered for on that day, other than being shot.
So, and I like, he gets shot at his Jimi Hendrix moment. Like, he's at the peak of his fame, his peak of his powers, and he doesn't have time to become the old fat Elvis, if I can mix metaphors there, So he dies at the peak of his glory, and he's not making those movies with the jumpsuits and the big sideburns. So Kris, let me ask you to kind of, what is Lee's plan? There's a lot of mythology around Lee and Jackson sitting on the cracker boxes with the map spread out next to the firelight as they're trying to cook up this plan. What is it that they're trying to do?
Well, Lee and Jackson, just to give a real brief overview of the Chancellorsville campaign, so as you alluded to, there's this cracker box meeting. This is what's on the screen right now. And I'll show some maps here in a second. What Robert E. Lee has to do in April of 1863 is essentially play to the tune of Joseph Hooker, the Union Army commander. The Union Army has approximately 130,000 men ready to go at the outset of the late April campaign. And what Hooker intends to do is use maneuver and his overwhelming numbers to force Lee's hand. Lee has been stationed around Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is 50 miles south of Washington, 55 miles north of the Confederate capital of Richmond. He's been there all winter. But the supply situation is strained, just given that Central and Northern Virginia have been fought over for the last 2 years, essentially. You've had armies back and forth over top of this land like two plagues of locusts. The locals even call their Confederate defenders lice because they can't get rid of them. They keep coming back. So Lee has to spread his army out all the way from Norfolk, Virginia and Suffolk, Virginia, where James Longstreet and two of his divisions of the First Corps are stationed, sending supplies up to Richmond and Lee's army. Then you have Lee's army spread out for about 35 to 40 miles along the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers, and then deeper down towards Ashland that you see on the map. And so what you're seeing here is Lee's army very spread out, and it is under strength. He has about 60 to 65,000 men when the spring campaign starts, much like he will have 1 year later at the outset of the Overland campaign in May of 1864. Now, Hooker, who is in charge of the Union Army, comes up with a very simple plan. He is going to split his army into three wings. The left wing will cross below Fredericksburg and keeps Lee's attention, while his right wing will make a swinging march around the left flank of the Confederates, utilize a number of river fords, Ely's Ford, Germanna Ford, Kelly's Ford, to ford the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers, and then start to march towards Chancellorsville, which is a crossroads town, quote unquote. He doesn't intend to fight there. Hooker does not. He wants to keep marching towards Fredericksburg, where he will smash Lee between the two wings of his army, or force them to come out of their works and fight him in open fields, or ingloriously fly towards Richmond, where you see a dotted line on our screen. That would be George Stoneman's cavalry, who would be swinging to the south, cutting the rail lines as well as communication lines, and thwarting Lee as he would potentially be falling back towards Richmond. Now,
can I just pause you just for a quick second? I'm used to the John Madden pen by this point. I have to admit, I'm a little disappointed that the map is not getting little yellow lines on it, Kris.
I'm restraining myself.
Oh, okay.
I'm restraining myself. I'm sure it will come out later, but for now, I'm going to try to use my skills as an interpreter to allow the beautiful map that Hal Jesperson has created for us to do the talking. So what Lee then does, he meets with Stonewall Jackson on April 29th below Fredericksburg. That's whenever the Union Army makes its move across the Rappahannock River and towards Lee's men stationed near Fredericksburg. This will be the first time in the campaign that Jackson decides that he wants to strike out towards the Union forces. But he and Lee will talk for a few minutes, and both of them agree that this aggressive movement wasn't as aggressive on the Union side as they thought it would be, and maybe something else is amiss. Now, to the west, they'll get word from Jeb Stuart, as well as a few other junior Confederate officers, saying there are Union troops coming in towards our rear. Lee will ascertain that there's a problem out to the west. Then he will dispatch his de facto second in command, Jackson, because Longstreet is not here. Jackson's his second in command. Jackson will march out to the west with some troops starting on April 30th, around midnight on April 30th to May 1st. And that's when you'll have a meeting engagement out near Chancellorsville. That's where Jackson will engage with Hooker's army, and that's where he will stop Hooker's army cold. It has just as much to do with Joe Hooker not pushing his advantage that he has against Jackson as it does with Jackson's aggressiveness that'll show out in that sector. And to Rob's point, where Jackson doesn't do a lot in this battle, he doesn't feel, I think May 1st, he does a good job of forcing Hooker and thwarting Hooker's plan. From that point forward, we can definitely debate. So what'll happen next, very briefly, is that the two sides, as they meet out on this first day's battlefield, as we call it, at the American Battlefield Trust, the Union Army will start to pull back around the Chancellorsville crossroads, because Jackson, commanding some of his own troops as well as Longstreet's troops that are on the field here, you'll see the Union Army start to pull back around the crossroads at Chancellorsville. Once this happens, Joe Hooker's given up the initiative, and that's what Lee needed. Lee needed the initiative pulled away from Hooker, whose army is just so vast and so large and has the advantage coming into this campaign. Now with Joe Hooker starting to go on the defensive around the Chancellorsville crossroads, what Lee can do here is to start to develop a battle plan. And that battle plan, it's debated, and we can talk about this, of actually who comes up with it. Lee and Jackson, here comes the John Madden pen, who will be in this area, will sit down, they'll meet on their cracker box, and they will decide somehow. A lot of people give Jackson the credit. I think it's Lee, Jackson, Stewart, a few other people who come up with this plan to send Jackson's 28,000-man corps around the front of the Union Army, march for about 12 miles using some roads, and arrive on the right flank of the Union Army. Lee, at the same time, will have about 14,000 men here on the eastern side of a salient. On the western side, you'll have Jackson, and then in the middle, you have about 90,000 Union soldiers who are some positioned very well, some not positioned so well. Earthen fortifications, trees will be a problem. This is called a wilderness for a reason. It's a dense second and third growth forest, 70 square miles, and some soldiers said even at the brightest point of the day, you couldn't see the forest floor because the foliage was so thick. So this is not a great battlefield. Hooker didn't intend to fight here. Now Lee did come out of his works to fight him like he wanted. He has him in actually a pretty good position with Jackson on one flank and Lee on the other. All Hooker has to do is lurch out and attack. But what Lee and Jackson want to do is smash this salient from both sides, as Rob alluded to. Lee always wants to go for broke. It's that Western way of war, as we call it as military historians, go for that decisive battle.
Now, Rob, this is not the first time that Lee has sent Jackson long down the field. Is this it's kind of Jackson's specialty to go off on these kind of large maneuvers, big grand thinking. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was really impressed by Chris's map there with the John Madden pen. That was pretty cool. I think the most notable, obviously, Lee gives Jackson a lot of leeway in many different circumstances. The Valley Campaign 62 is one of them. But I think one of the ones where he really trusts him is the Second Manassas Campaign, when Lee is trying to confront basically two Union armies in Virginia, Army of Potomac under McClellan, which would be posted along the James River at Harrison's Landing at that point. Of course, Lincoln is calling McClellan back north, but of course Lee doesn't really know if that's true or not, so he has to decide what to do, and he decides to go after the Army of Virginia, which is located in the Culpeper County, Central Virginia, under John Pope. Of course, John Pope is famous for his tactics against the civilians in Virginia. He's called the miscreant. But I think, Pope is kind of looked at wrongly at that point in time, because what Pope is doing in 1862 is what Union armies will be doing in 1864, and that's basically bringing total war to the South. But Lee decides to move Jackson up there. Jackson does confront part of Pope's army at Cedar Mountain. Not a great battle for Jackson, because he outnumbers his opponent and almost loses that battle, but he is able to win that battle, and Pope will pull back to a place called Rappahannock Station, which is today Remington, Virginia, and then Lee will decide to bring the rest of his army up to join with Jackson, And then Lee again will give Jackson the privilege of leading half of the army, a little bit under half of his army, on a wide flank march, 22 miles in basically 2 days. Actually, around longer than 22 miles, but a two-day hike, going from Culpeper all the way out to Jeffersonton, which is a smaller village still there today, up through the Loudoun Valley, then through Thoroughfare Gap. And then Jackson's mission is to strike the supply line, the Army of Virginia's supply line along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. He'll do that at a place called Bristow Station. And from there, just determine, as Lee would say, determine where you can find an advantage. Of course, they are able to do that at the Battle of Second Manassas, where Jackson does a great job fighting off Pope's army by himself for almost 2 days. And then, of course, Longstreet will arrive, and I think Lee's greatest victory is Second Manassas, not Chancellorsville. Just because of
How dare you?
I know, right? I know. I'm glad someone said something there. Just because of all the political impacts that had, the next step beyond that. Obviously, Gettysburg is very important, but I think I'm a Joe Harsh disciple, so apologize for that up front. But after Second Manassas, if you look at what's going on in the West and what's going on in the East, the Confederate tide is rising, as Joe Harsh said. And I think that's probably the time for the Confederacy really to do something to maybe possibly win the war. I won't say win the war, but obviously have a huge impact, bigger than 1863 in my opinion. So Jackson's been given many chances by Lee. Lee trusts him. There's a couple of times where Jackson has let him down. We could probably talk about sleeping at White Oak Swamp here later if you want. The 7 days campaign for Jackson is probably his worst moment during the war, but he's definitely trusted by Lee, and he has been throughout the war up to this point.
I think in the Antietam campaign, I'm going out to Harper's Ferry. He's got that independent command there. Right. Down at Fredericksburg, when Lee is coalescing around the city, he sends Jackson down to Port Royal. So, Jackson gets a lot of these independent missions. Here we're on the same battlefield. We're not using kind of a landscape across the map as we are. But, Lee has a lot of confidence that he can send Jackson on one of these sweeping maneuvers. Oh, look who has shown up here in my office, right? It's Stonewall Jackson himself. So just lending his spirit to our conversation. So Kris, as Jackson gets into position on the flank there, things went pretty smoothly for him, but he's a little slower getting into position than everybody had hoped.
Yeah, and to Rob's point, I think that Jackson, and this is something I always explore whenever I'm giving tours of Chancellorsville or other places where Jackson's involved. I have to say Jackson does not play well with others. He does not like the chain of command at all. That is proven out time and time again. Even in the old army, he gets into a huff with people, constantly leveling charges against subordinates or superiors. I mean, that's one of the reasons he left the old army, was because of a fight with William Blinky French and Absalom Baird. He's just a guy who, as an independent commander, when he's successful beating up on B-list Union generals and he outnumbers them, he can do well. But once push comes to shove and he actually is called to task by people like A.P. Hill and others, he does not play well with others. He has some deep-seated trust issues. They go back to his childhood. That's just the fact of the matter. All you have to do is psychologically look at Stonewall Jackson. The guy has some deep-seated trust issues, which then plays out with his chain of command. And on the morning of May 2nd, like you said, he does get off to a late start. It's about 7:30 in the morning when he starts his flank attack. I'll bring that map up for everybody to see. And I shouldn't say the flank attack, I should say the flank march. So as he's moving forward, Jackson has 12 miles to cover. And something people have to keep in mind, and to be fair to Jackson, this is the first campaign of the season. These guys are just getting their legs under them again, getting their marching legs. They had to march from Fredericksburg the day before. Now here they are camped, getting ready to march again. And it's not exactly a 12-mile march. Some of these units are stationed 15 or more miles away from the point of contact with the enemy. So Jackson will get moving about 7:30. He'll move down to an area called the Katherine Iron Furnace. There, There'll be a small unit action around the Katherine Iron Furnace late in the morning, early afternoon of May the 2nd, when the Union Third Corps will advance down towards the Katherine Iron Furnace, trying to figure out exactly what Jackson's doing, because they could spot Jackson's column moving through a split in the trees, and shells are raining in on Jackson's column. So this is not a secretive attack at this point. Jackson's 28,000 men will march. They'll get to the Katherine Iron Furnace. They'll go deeper to the south. Joe Hooker, has some advantages here. First off, he's on a defensive. He has hot air balloons that he can send up into the air. Aeronauts, as they're known. They can see out into the woods to a point, but they can't figure out exactly what's going on because they can't see the great distance given the wilderness here. One of those balloons is north of Chancellorsville. The other one's over by Fredericksburg. So the Union Army knows something is up. But what ends up happening is that Joe Hooker misinterprets what Lee and Jackson are doing. Hooker, rightfully so, thinks that this column is actually heading off in this direction towards Gordonsville, Virginia, which is a rail center, it's a supply center, and it's open fields where Lee could do better to fight in open fields and get reinforcements and supplies. So that's the idea. It's also allegedly the fried chicken capital of the United States, I always like to point out.
That's right.
So when Hooker loses sight of these guys, he doesn't know that Jackson's actually doubling back north because he's using some roads that are unknown to the Union forces. They're not on the maps. They don't have Google Earth. They don't have Google Maps. And maps are a problem at this point. So Jackson starts to turn to the north. Hooker, in the meantime, has sent his entire 18,000-man 3rd Army Corps down to the Iron Furnace. He's called out to his right flank, out to the 11th Corps. He's called their reserve brigade of about 12 to 1,400 men down to the Iron Furnace. Adding insult to injury, their incompetent commander, Oliver Otis Howard, will ride along with them. The 11th Corps commander, he's going to go down here. So what Hooker has done is created a gap in the center of his line almost. He's isolated the Union right flank. He has the smallest corps on that flank, but they also don't think that they're going to be attacked by Confederates. They've lost their reserve brigade. They've lost their commander. And now Stonewall Jackson is starting to materialize out in these woods. His men will start to deploy as early as 2 to 2:30 in the afternoon. Never trust any of their watches. But he won't launch his attack until about 5:15 because his column is going to be strung out. Plus, they're dealing with the woods to the north and to the south side of the Orange Turnpike, which is modern-day Route 3, and that will be Jackson's axis of advance towards the Chancellorsville Crossroads and towards where Robert E. Lee's waiting troops are.
And as he's getting, his march is so long. His column is strung out over 10 miles on the road. It takes about 6 hours for the column to pass any one point. So if he's going to wait for all of that to close up, he's never going to be able to launch his attack in a timely fashion. So he's going to launch that attack with 2 out of his 3 divisions and send them forward, and then have A.P. Hill come in as the fresh reserves. But I gotta wonder, how fresh are those reserves, Kris? If they've been marching all day, they've marched out from Fredericksburg, they can't be all that fresh.
No, not really. I mean, what you're looking at here is a map from the American Battlefield Trust. These are available over at battlefields.org. This is Jackson's flank attack. The Union 11th Corps is largely, as you can see on the map, facing to the south. Their main line runs to the south side of the Orange Turnpike, which is, again, modern-day Route 3. And out on the right flank, you can see 2 regiments facing to the west, the 41st New York, the 153rd Pennsylvania. These units are what are supposed to meet Robert Rhodes's 8,000 Confederates, which are in the first line. Second line will be Raleigh Colston's division, and then coming up in reserve will be A.P. Hill. Jackson, because he doesn't have a lot of time, he can't extend his flank towards the Rappahannock River and Rapidan rivers, which are off to the north and out to the west, because of the time of day as well as the trees. He's got to put together essentially a division front, stack it one behind the other, and use the weight of his soldiers to carry the position. Now, granted, there's only a handful of cannon and perhaps 800 Union soldiers facing out to the west. They're outflanked by the Confederates to the north and to the south. So, they really aren't going to stand a chance, because what will end up happening is at about 5:15 in the afternoon, Jackson's men will come rolling down. And as any of the Union 11th Corps men try to meet this threat, as they start to wheel backwards, keeping that unit cohesion, they're going to have one domino falling on top of them, meaning one regiment to their right will fall, then the next, then the next. And it's just going to intermingle all of these commands to the point, which you see on the right-hand side of the map, the fragmented elements of the 11th Corps. That is the 11th Corps being swept off the field in approximately 45 minutes to an hour. They don't all just break and run. There is a few different stands, specifically at a place called the Bushbeck Line, which is here. That is probably about a half-hour action. That is a mixed units of everything in the 11th Corps throwing together a battle line facing towards the west. They slow down Jackson's first wave. His second wave adds to the weight, and then they just take the 11th Corps off the field. And as you notice on the right-hand side of the map, there are no 12th or 3rd Corps troops there because there's a massive gap between the 11th Corps and the rest of the Union Army.
So Jackson basically gets a whole bunch of real estate for free and is able to advance. But because of all this action, his advance is pretty tumultuous, pretty uneven. His line has overlapped the Federals so significantly that he's got portions of the line that are able to sweep forward uncontested, while others really get snarled in small action combats with the Federals. But then the wilderness itself also plays a factor in bogging down this advance. Some guys run into bogs, thickets, holly bushes. I like to tell people it's pricker bushes, holly bushes, rhododendrons, whiplash oaks, scraggly pines, and it's all full of snakes and ticks. I mean, just an absolutely unhospitable region. And so it looms large in opposing Jackson's advance. So as his men start to get bogged down, Jackson continues to push them forward, but eventually they run out of steam. What causes him to finally bring everything to a halt, Kris?
I mean, there's a few reasons that they're forced to come to a halt, but mainly it is going to be unit cohesion breaking down with the Confederate forces. What you're going to start to see, as Kris pointed out, Mother Nature's playing against them. This is Jackson's last line. This is AP Hill's light division. There's nothing light about it. It's 12,000 plus men here on May 2nd of 1863. They're deploying in the woods. You can see the Plank Road in the middle. That's modern day Route 3. It's also known as the Orange Turnpike. Name is interchangeable at different points. Made it very confusing until the late 90s, whenever the 911 system kind of worked that out down here in this part of Virginia for us. But the area here, you can see Jackson coming up. Now, Jackson's men, they're running into a few problems. Number one is Mother Nature. Number two is the fact that the Union Army, many of them are not standing and fighting, they're running away. So to capture any of these men, you might have to run from your lines, break those lines to tackle them and capture your men. Large numbers of Union soldiers are being captured, so you have to deal with those prisoners. Then these men have been marching all day. They're hungry. They're going to go through the camps, and they're going to eat. They're going to grab pots, pans, eat, shout, fire, and rush on, as one man will say. And then you will also have some Union counterattacks. You'll have the Bushbeck Line, which is a defensive stand. Then you'll have the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry, who will show up onto the field and strike Jackson's center. So you'll have this intermingling of Confederate units. Darkness is starting to come across the field. It's coming around 8 to 8:15 on the evening of May 2nd. So it's a lot of factors that start to play into this attack. So Jackson's men may have advanced for 3 miles, his first 2 waves. That's coming from their jumping off point until the point where they've been halted and pulled off of the front and allowed Hill's men to come to the front and assume the role of the next offensive.
So, Rob, this has been a pretty tumultuous couple hours for both armies as they're fighting their way through the wilderness, fighting each other, fighting their own fears. Put me in the heads of what's going on with these guys at this moment.
Well, I mean, you guys have spoken really well about the march, getting up early and the long march they had to take to get to the point of making this attack. And then, of course, it may seem easy to us to push the 11th Corps out of the way, but, some Confederates did get shot at. So we don't want to forget that. Like Kris just mentioned, Bushbeck Line being probably one of the more well-known spots on the battlefield of that taking place. So, these guys are fought out. At least the first wave is fought out, and I'm sure the AP Hills guys are not, well rested, as we just mentioned a little while ago. And, it's also, it's getting dark, and I don't know many Civil War soldiers that like fighting in the dark. At least I've never read any letters of them saying they prefer it that way. Of course, back then with so much fog of war going on, it's hard to know, especially in this kind of atmosphere, right? With with the wilderness and the thickets and everything you just so poetically described, ticks, snakes, everything else. It's not a welcoming place to fight a battle anyways. And now it's getting dark and these guys are worn out. But one thing Jackson does have, and I know I'm very critical of Jackson, but his men love him. And I think they would follow him to hell and back if they could. And so he definitely, the men are, for most part, I would think, are very motivated because of their leader. Not talking about the gods and generals, Jackson. I'm talking about the real guy. The crazy scene there, with all the men swarming around Jackson and loving on him. They did have affection for him. But, you guys have really well put in place the long march, the early morning get up, the long march, and then the conditions of fighting. But again, I think we don't give I can't believe I'm saying this. We don't give the 11th Corps guys enough credit for, they did slow him down a little bit, and maybe a speed bump, but those guys didn't just pick up and run, as Kris said. So those guys did fight. Not all of them, but they did fight, and they they did have an impact on how the battle, the outcome of the battle.
What stock do you put in Union leadership at this point to be able to respond to this crisis?
Well, as Kris said, Hooker, after the first day's fight, of course, history's been hard on Hooker too, but I'm not going to say he checks out, but he's definitely been rattled. You got John Reynolds sleeping at one point in time. Sorry, I had to pick on John Reynolds for a second.
I was asked once if he's narcoleptic because he falls asleep.
I don't know. I mean, there's some good Corps commanders in this Army, and I don't think they perform badly. As Kris said at the very beginning, the heaviest fighting isn't the day that we're talking about; it's the day next. And the Federal Army does pretty well holding off all these assaults. Howard obviously doesn't do well, and then of course, Howard doesn't do terribly bad when he gets shifted out west. So I think we like to pick on Hooker and the Federal Command a lot, but given the circumstances, and obviously we can argue about how they allowed this battle to develop the way it did, which obviously was a failing on their part. But I think once the fighting started, those guys fought pretty well, and their leaders should be given credit for that. This is a very pro-union Rob here. I have no idea what's going on.
To Rob's point, I mean, the 11th Corps is probably the worst led Corps. Howard is only been in command for less than a month at this point. He's not well loved by the men of the 11th Corps. They don't like him. They lost their beloved commander, Franz Sigel, who is not anything. He's not a great commander either. Their 1st Division commander, Charles Devens, is incompetent. He's been seen this day running his horse into a tree where he hurt his leg, and then what do you do to take care of that? Drink whiskey. So he's potentially drunk on the field, doesn't particularly like any of the Germans. The Germans at this point, it's not 100% a German Corps. It's maybe 60%, between 56 and 60% German, or of other nationalities from that part of Europe. So what you're looking at there is you have some problems, but you actually have decent commanders in the 11th Corps at the brigade level and division level. Carl Schurz, even though I don't think he gets enough credit, he's one who tries to stand and fight. Vladimir Szczepanovsky, Adolphus Buschbeck, others try. Colonel John Lee, who's out on that end of the line. These guys all want to put up a fight, and they try. They really do. But at the end of the day, they're in a terrible position, and there's nothing they can do. Once you move into the Corps level, you have a lot of solid Corps commanders, including Dan Sickles. Dan Sickles might not be, the best Corps commander out there, but that guy can fight. He can handle a Corps fairly well. But you've got George Meade, who is the best combat commander in the Army of the Potomac at this point, Darius Couch, and then at the division level, the Union Army has competent division level commanders, and it'll come to show the next day. It'll be the high command, and as Jim Lighthizer always says, the head stinks from the top, and here it's that way. Here the fish stinks from the top. This is the way it is here with the Union high command. The problem is Joe Hooker not trusting those commanders underneath him. Fast forward 2 months later, George Gordon Meade, using largely a lot of the same guys at the Battle of Gettysburg, trusts his subordinates and ends up winning the battle.
One thing I feel compelled to point out with Howard, because he does take a lot of abuse and most of it is deserved, is that when he does have to shift his reserves down to help out around Catherine Furnace, he personally leads them. And he was not a man who was short on personal bravery at all. And, he thought that's where the action was. The fight had shifted down there and he's leading his men into the fight. At least that's what he's thinking. It turns out to be a completely misreading of the situation. But at least he thinks he's trying to do the right thing at that right moment. When Jackson's men come crashing into his corps, he later says, "I wish I could have died," because he was so embarrassed and so humiliated by the way that his men were so overcome. And he tucks the flag underneath the stump of his lost arm. He tries to rally his men, and a little too late. Too little too late, but he does want to stay when they have the Council of War for the United States. He wants to stay and keep fighting it out. He wants to try to redeem that ruined reputation of his. So, Kris, let's kind of pick up our narrative. Let's go to this moment here. This is my little Fredericksburg National Military Park trading card of a volley in the dark. Jackson's men have bogged down. I'm just pulling out all of my my tchotchke here tonight.
I tell you what.
Jackson's men have bogged down. He now needs to figure out what he's going to do to resume that attack. Can you put us back on the field?
Here's the far more accurate Courier and Ives.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
That's
That's
awesome.
awesome.
Look like. This is exactly,
Great.
I mean, from the battle flags all the way down to the terrain, that is
Love it.
100% accurate.
Good
We're
stuff.
looking at the Courier and Ives print of Jackson very melodramatically leaning back.
And well dressed too.
Yes.
Yeah, looks good. I like the plumage in his hat.
Yes.
The hat stays on as he's tipping over.
Yeah, so around 8:15, and to Rob's point, Gods and Jackson in many ways is just a horrid movie, especially whenever you get into the Chancellorsville battle and you notice the same Confederate line coming out like 8 different times, same guy doing the same charge and the same scream, time and time again. Then you see the Magnificent Seven, as I call them, him and his staff riding down the turnpike to the front. That's farcical. And then I love whenever he would just stop and pray at random too. But Jackson is close to the front. He is not at the front. He's not riding there with pistol drawn towards the front. But as I bring up the map showing what's going to turn out, Jackson's going to ride forward to a point that is going to be an intersection of 2 roads. One is the Orange Turnpike, and that's that modern day Route 3 that I've mentioned a number of times, right about where J and A and Jackson is. It'll meet another road called the Mountain Road, and then the Mountain Road will meet a road called the Bullock Road and run off towards the northeast. The Plank Road will run in this direction, and then you'll have the Mountain Road eventually near the Chancellorsville Crossroads coming together along the the Orange Turnpike. So what Jackson's doing is he's called a halt for his first 2 waves, gets them out of the way, brings up A.P. Hill, who is his second in command. Hill and Jackson loathe one another. And right before the Chancellorsville campaign, it had come to loggerheads. The two are getting ready to do a duel in a courtroom at a court martial, not a physical duel, which I would have loved to have seen because I think A.P. Hill would have fought dirty. But the whole thing is coming to a head. Jackson and Hill just don't like one another. Lee has a major problem on his hands with these two, and it's really petty on both sides. But regardless, Jackson pulls up Hill. Hill's his second in command. Hill is going to start deploying his light division, and Jackson is going to tell him in a certain way, press them, Hill, cut them off from the United States forward, press them. And what he means by that is them is obviously the enemy, the Union Army, but he's going to tell Hill to cut the Union off from a ford that would sit well off of the Bullock Road, a place called the United States Ford. I mean, this ford is miles from the front at this point. Jackson, I think this is where he starts to lose it. He doesn't understand what the enemy is looking like right now. The enemy line is starting to pull back into a salient position, and I'll get us another map to show that. The enemy is starting to pull back into a large pimple, as I like to call it, and this is going to be problematic for the Confederates. So Joe Hooker's line, as I sit here to try to find it for you, is going to look something like this on the evening of May the 2nd. This isn't exact. This is a next day map, but near where Jackson is wounded, which is right about here, just below the 3 in Sickles, that's for the 3rd Corps. The Union Army is well entrenched. You have the Union 1st Army Corps, which will actually at this point run off in this direction. You'll have the 5th Corps down here, Sickles 3rd Corps, the Slocum's 12th Corps. So this is going to be a tough nut to crack if you're Jackson. There's Union troops on the evening of May 2nd at Hazel Grove. And now what Jackson is telling Hill to do is actually go off in this direction to go to United States Ford. You know, Hill is not only going to have to glance off the front of part of the 12th Corps at this point, he's also going to have to run into the 5th Corps, the 1st Corps, elements of 2nd Corps. He doesn't know exactly what this enemy starts to look like because Hooker is actually rolling with the punches. Hooker, who is at the Chancellorsville Crossroads, is going to order cannons to face out towards the west. He's going to order a band to start playing military airs so that gets the men's spirits up, and then he's going to start pulling the men that he ordered from the Katherine Iron Furnace, which is down in this direction, back into the battle line. So Hooker is rolling with the punches. And Jackson is going to start to hear out in front of his men pickaxes. He's going to hear trees falling. And what he's actually hearing is the Union Army out in front of him starting to entrench. He's also starting to hear troops shift around. So Jackson does not like what he's starting to hear. And Jackson himself will actually ride with 8 other men down this mountain road. He's going to follow a young man from the 9th Virginia Cav who lives at the end of the Bullock Road, a kid named Oscar. That's Oscar Bullock's farm. He's going to follow David Kyle. Kyle is going to lead him down this mountain road, and eventually Jackson's going to stop, sit there for a moment, listen, hear those trees falling, and then start to turn back. Now, this is not a static moment like you see in this map. Other things are happening. Down the plank road that you see here, the Orange Turnpike, modern day Route 3, is going to be A.P. Hill with 10 men riding forward. So you have 19 horsemen, including Jackson and Hill, going down the mountain road as well as the turnpike. As they go forward, the 18th and 37th North Carolina of James Lane's North Carolina Brigade are starting to deploy. Nobody knows that the 2 senior officers on this flank of the battlefield for the Confederacy are out in front. This goes back to Jackson's trust issues. He is a lieutenant general. He has lieutenants to do this job for him. But Jackson, rather than sending someone out to the front, which he should be doing, this is no place for a lieutenant general. People can say, oh, no, it's bravery, blah, blah, blah. No, it's stupidity. He is going to ride out there with 8 men. He's going to turn back, and he is going to, as he turns back, start to receive peppering shots from the 18th North Carolina. Hill will do the same thing. He'll ride down the road, can't find Jackson. Hill, of course, is like, man, I'm going to get court-martialed for everything, so I got to find out where Jackson is. I got to find out where I'm supposed to attack. He starts to turn back as well. So you have about 19 horsemen riding back towards the 18th and 37th North Carolina. These North Carolinians are looking around. They see at least 80 dead horses around them, as well as about 20 to 30 dead and wounded Union cavalrymen, because there was a failed cavalry charge at the 8th Pennsylvania Cav here just a few hours earlier. So you have these dismounted troopers who are wounded off to the side of the road or dead, 80 dead horses, and now you have a cavalcade of officers riding towards you from the point where the enemy is sitting. So if you're in the 18th or 37th North Carolina, you're going to go, oh crap, we have another Cav attack. We have to meet this. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Kris, do you want me to keep going, or do you want to go?
No, it's a great instance of the fog of war because of the 8th Virginia Cavalry. There have been horsemen out here where there shouldn't be. There's a Pennsylvania infantry unit, the 128th Pennsylvania, that kind of comes careening in from the southwest. They miss the pickets and run into the 7th North Carolina. So there's a quick little exchange there, and all the Pennsylvanians get captured. So now there are infantry out there where there shouldn't be. And it's in the middle of this no man's land between that picket line that you see in the main battle line that Jackson and Hill have ridden. And I'll go back to your comment earlier about Jackson's trust issues. You say that that's no place for a lieutenant general. A.P. Hill's out there. He's a major general. It's no place for him either. But he knows that if he doesn't go see things from himself, Jackson's not going to trust the word of any of his lieutenants either. So Hill really has to, feels compelled to get this information firsthand for himself, because he knows Jackson's not going to take the word of any old lieutenant. That's why Jackson himself is out there. So
yeah, and Jackson's trust issues go back to his childhood. He lost both of his parents at a young age. He lost his wife. He's lost 2 children. His sister has stuck with the North. That was his closest companion outside of his second wife. He has some deep-seated trust issues, and it comes out time and time again. This is a guy who just really doesn't see he only sees the world in black and white, and there's no pun intended. There's no gray area in his world. It is one way or the other. And Jackson just, he is inflexible, which a lot of people say, oh, that's great. But, the men who served underneath him, there are a lot of letters of men who do not like Stonewall Jackson during the war. After the war, he's placed up on that pedestal, but there are men in the First Corps, there are men in the Second Corps who are actually happy that Jackson had been wounded and was kind of a comeuppance for him. A.P. Hill is one of them who wrote about Jackson's wounding a few months prior to the Battle of Chancellorsville. There's no love lost there. So Jackson's trust issues really, that's why he's out here. He doesn't even trust David Kyle. David Kyle sent to him by Jeb Stuart, who, Jackson allegedly trusts, and Kyle, who's from this area and says that he knows every hog path in this area. Jackson doesn't even believe him, and he rides behind Kyle for a ways and just to see if this yokel knows where he's going. Then he figures it out, and then Jackson kind of takes the lead and rides down the road himself.
Yeah, it's literally Kyle's backyard. He lives in the Bullock Farm. And,
yeah.
Rob, you're nodding your head.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're allowed to ask each other questions.
Yeah.
One thing that has never been fully explained to me, or to a lot of people that I've talked to about this incident, is the mountain road. Why is it called the mountain road? There's not a mountain within 50 miles of this spot, but you always see it called Mountain Road, right? And all the interpreters at the site call it the Mountain Road. But where's the mountain?
You want that one, Kris, or you want me to take it?
Go ahead.
So the Mountain Road actually, I was digging around in papers now over a decade ago, and I found that this road actually, we show it on this map. It's a little bit over 2 miles long, maybe in this area, maybe 1.5 miles to 2 miles long, and it goes from the Chancellorsville crossroads. It doesn't stop right there. It's just to the west of it. Then it picks up where you see here, runs through where the visitor center sits today, as you can see on the map, and then connects back with modern day 3, right about where you see the J and A in Jackson. The mountain road then again picks up out near Germanna, which is about 7 miles to the west, to the left if you're looking at this map, and it starts to run towards the Shenandoah Mountains. So whenever I read that, this road was for 2 different purposes, and even though it terminates and then comes back to life down the road a little ways to the west, what I've read and found is that it was running out towards the Shenandoah or the Blue Ridge Mountains, and it was also a logging road, and it was a road to help avoid the tolls. So right. They cut this road to bypass some of the toll booths that would have been running along the Orange Turnpike, because this was one of the improved roads that was paid for. So that's where I found it from, and that was back in 2008. I found that in the papers of the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park.
And that's why the road appears and disappears from the turnpike.
Right, where the toll booths are, right? Which is pretty common for that time period for any turnpike.
Yeah. So this thing, that was the best that I found. I think that was written in the 1830s or 40s, talking about it. And that would pick up roughly, by my understanding of that account, near where the 7-Eleven is today. It comes back to life out near the modern day Route 20, Route 3 intersection out on the Wilderness Battlefield.
So Jackson's come back. He's been peppered by shots from the 18th North Carolina. Hill has come back. He's also caught in some of that peppering, and concentrated volley is going to ripple up from the south as this fog of war continues. When Jackson's men are first shot at, several of the men get shot off their horses. One of them is his brother-in-law, Joseph Morrison, as serving as a staff officer. And Morrison hops up and says, "Stop, you're firing into your own men." And the 18th North Carolina, being a veteran unit, they've seen every trick in the book. They've seen dead horses out here where there shouldn't be. They've had, infantry out here where there shouldn't be. So when this body of horsemen comes at them, they have every reason to think that this is a federal party of horsemen coming at them. And so their major, John Barry, yells out, "It's alive, boys, pour it into him." And a concentrated volley erupts from the whole line, and that's what catches Jackson. He gets hit 3 times. Now, Kris is showing a map right now that indicates the location along the mountain road where Jackson is wounded. He's got another resource here I'm going to ask him to pull up that looks a little more scattershot. I'm going to ask him to break this down and sort of tell the story of how we know where Jackson is wounded and how we know where he wasn't wounded. Other research has suggested and other accounts have suggested a whole variety of other places where Jackson may have actually gotten shot. Kris, do you want to talk about this for a moment?
Yeah, I like to call this the dartboard map, where somebody just took darts and started throwing it at the map to see where Jackson may or may not have been actually hit. So there are a lot of people who claim to have been out here with Jackson. There are a lot of people who were with him. There are a lot of people who were not. So Jackson's in the 18th North Carolina, which is mispositioned on this map, would have been deployed back along the Bullock Road a little bit. They would have been firing at about 96 yards. Yes, that's what historians do. They actually walk out here and measure out where the wounding would be. Jackson was potentially wounded along the mountain road in this area where the visitor center sits today. The visitor center, which is actually my backdrop here on Zoom, that's the dedication in the 1960s of the Chancellorsville Battlefield Visitor Center. This is the area where Bob Crick is going to find the former chief historian of Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, the leading expert on the Army of Northern Virginia. He found the account that talks about David Kyle leading Jackson's men down the mountain road, as well as a few other accounts. And he places Jackson, and what I think quite accurately here along the mountain road, trying to get up out of the line of fire. Now, Jackson's going to be struck 3 times, once in the right palm of his hand, which will hit the webbing, and then he'll be struck in the left arm, once in the lower portion, once in the upper portion, and his horse will start to careen off in this direction. Jackson will be taken off the horse somewhere out in this area where there are way too many dots. Because does it matter if he's here? I mean, that's within like 3 feet. And then up here, it's within about 6 feet. You know, this is just, I think, utter nonsense, but that's just me. So as you come down here, you're going to have Jackson laid off his horse somewhere around 2 monuments that are out there today. One's stone, quartz stone. The other one is a large obelisk monument dedicated in 1888 by the governor of Virginia at the time, Fitzhugh Lee, former Confederate and nephew of Robert E. Lee. So Jackson's horse is out here. He's laid down somewhere out along the Plank Road, which makes sense. This will get him close enough to the Plank Road, the Orange Turnpike, where an ambulance can come up, and there is an ambulance that will come up into this vicinity. He'll be placed on a stretcher and to be carried to the rear, but one of the stretcher bearers will be struck by a shell, and he will be felled, dropping Jackson. Jackson will be placed on the stretcher a second time. The guy will trip over, one of his stretcher bearers will trip over a branch. Jackson will fall to the ground for a second time, and then eventually he's going to be placed on an ambulance and taken to the rear. But there are all kinds of different accounts that come out here. You know, the reality is, up until the late 90s, a lot of people thought it was in the vicinity of the monuments where Jackson was wounded. Most likely that is where he's taken off of his horse, and those monuments were also placed close to the main road so you could see the vicinity of where Jackson was wounded. According to Kyle and other accounts, he is going to be wounded, Jackson, up along the mountain road, and that's the interpretation that's out there today with the National Park Service.
And I think it's a great illustration of why it's important to actually walk the ground. Because if you look at the map here, actually one of the Jackson monuments is missing from the map too. But why would Jackson be riding through the middle of the woods when he was getting shot? He's not on the mountain road for most of these potential accounts. If you read Bud Robertson's book, which I think is fantastic, he actually has little Sorrel bolting off toward the parking lot. So again, maybe not necessarily familiarity with the ground, but helps you kind of make sense of what is accurate and what makes sense with some of these accounts. The other thing is, Kris points out, is little Sorrel bolts to the south toward the Plank Road. That's also couldn't put Jackson close enough so that A.P. Hill can hear the action. When A.P. Hill was out on the plank road, his men got caught in that same crossfire. Everybody in his party gets shot or has their horse shot out from underneath them and is captured. Everybody but Hill, who dives into the ditch at the last moment. And when he hears Jackson and his staff officers talking a few yards away from him in the woods, Hill's able to push through and find Jackson there. I know a lot of Jackson fans like to talk about a reconciliation that happened between Jackson and Hill. I think that's more wishful thinking than actually anything that's documented, but it is going to be up to Hill to take over. He's the senior division commander on the field. But as the artillery comes crashing in that Kris mentioned a few seconds ago, a piece of shrapnel is going to explode from one of those shells and hit Hill across the back of both legs, incapacitating him in such a way that he can't ride his horse, so he's not going to be able to take command. And Kris, I know that you tend to think that maybe that wasn't so much a bad injury as Hill just trying to avoid a bullet of a different sort.
Let me bring up the accurate map of the wounding of Stonewall Jackson. So, when Jackson goes down, obviously there's a vacuum in the chain of command, and that is where A.P. Hill will step in. Jackson, when he was carried on the stretcher, he is going to start bleeding profusely when he's dropped the second time. Potentially a bone shard is going to penetrate one of his arteries and he'll start to bleed. He'll lose maybe half of his blood by the time he is going to be operated on around 2:00 in the morning of May the 3rd. His left arm will be amputated about 3 inches below his left shoulder blade. Now Jackson, when he's dropped from roughly 5'8" off the ground. That's the average Civil War soldier's height, and they would be carrying him on a stretcher up on their shoulder. So he's going to fall very, very far, very quickly. So he's placed on this ambulance, taken back to the Wilderness Tavern. And then A.P. Hill, within 5 to 10 minutes, is knocked out of action. And in Hill, as Kris said, I don't think his heart was into this. He wrote a letter on November 18th of 1862 to Jeb Stuart complaining about having to serve under Jackson. Hill was attached to Jackson starting with the Second Manassas campaign and was stuck with Jackson until Jackson's demise at Chancellorsville. And he's going to talk about being stuck under this crazy old Presbyterian fool. Those are his words. And he said that he's like the porcupine, meaning Hill, and he has all of his stickers out. He's very upset having to serve under Jackson. But he goes on to say that, it doesn't matter what happens with Stonewall Jackson. I'm paraphrasing the letter, because even if the battle is lost, Jackson will not get any blame, but Hill will get all of the blame because Jackson gets all the laudits and Hill is the enemy of the state, as it were. So Hill, having this in the back of his mind, mix that with the fact he's taking over a pitched battle, and he was on the court-martial block, kind of like Fitzjohn Porter was after the Second Battle of Manassas. I'm not sure Hill's heart is into this. As soon as the battle ends, Hill is miraculously able to take command again and jump right back into it. So, there could be something there that he is not wanting to take over this potential mess, because remember, the Battle of Chancellorsville is not won and lost here on May the 2nd. When Jackson goes down, Hill's men are deployed to attack towards, 85,000 or so Union soldiers. Jackson wants Hill to attack up towards the 1st, the 5th, the 12th, and the 2nd Army Corps. This is one Confederate division taking on elements of 4 Federal Infantry Corps, which would be in the way between here and Bank and United States Ford. This is a no-win situation. Now, to get to Lee, what's on the other side of it? You have to deal with the 2nd, the 3rd, the 12th Corps at least to get to Robert E. Lee's position. So on the evening of May the 2nd, it's dark. It's 9:00 at night. 2 of your 3 divisions have been played out. They're in the woods trying to pull themselves together after this flank attack. You've got Lee, who's at least 2 miles away. You have your men who are trying to figure out where they are in the woods, and they're accidentally shooting their own commander. And now you have an aroused enemy of between 80 and 85,000 men between you and Robert E. Lee. This is the Kobayashi Maru if you're Bill Shatner and the Wrath of Khan.
Wow.
Stonewall Jackson's lost so much blood, he's gotten pale. And it looks like he's lost both of them.
How many Jackson Chotskys do you have there, Mackowski?
I only have 2 with me here, but I do have others in the other room. But I want to bring you back into this conversation here, Rob, and ask you about this moment. And what does this moment mean for the Confederates, and what has it come to mean?
I mean, what it means day of and what it means today is, almost two different things, right? As Kris just said, I think this evening, the Army of Northern Virginia is in a very precarious situation. They're split. They're confused. They've lost easily Lee's second in command on the field. They've lost AP Hill, who knows, at least knows the men. We can argue his competence all day long, but at least he would be familiar with the guys he would be leading. So they're in a precarious situation, even though today we think of this being Lee's greatest victory, and Jackson won this huge battle at the very beginning, and what happened afterward was just kind of postscript. But you guys know that it's not the case. Most of the fighting takes place the next day and the day after. But you have the rise of Jeb Stuart as an infantry commander here, taking over for Jackson. Our good friend Ryan Quint would be jumping up and down right now if we didn't mention Drainesville. Drainesville, small little action up here in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, where Stuart's in command of a couple regiments of infantry. And from all accounts, and I think Stuart does pretty well leading these men. It does surprise me that Stuart was willing to kind of take that command, and then as Kris alluded to earlier, AP Hill comes back eventually and takes command of this. Of course, the whole army is reconfigured, but takes command of a lot of Jackson's guys. But it's a precarious situation that night, and I think that's lost a lot in the overall history of the battle. One of the interesting stories I wrote a blog piece about, yes, Kris, many years ago, I used to write blog pieces for Emerging Civil War. There's a guy in the ambulance that evening, Major Arthur Rogers, who is in the ambulance with Crutchfield, who've both been wounded. Rogers is kind of a neat guy. He's from where I'm from. He's up here from Loudoun County, Aldie, Middleburg area. Goes to VMI, drops out of VMI, physically can't make it. Reminds me of myself if I ever went to military school, but becomes a lawyer. And then when the war breaks out, forms an artillery battery, the Loudoun Artillery, which doesn't really have a crazy track record. They are at 1st and 2nd Manassas, but by October 1862, the unit's dissolved and incorporated into other artillery battalions. Then Rogers will become on Crutchfield's staff. And of course, he's with Crutchfield here at Chancellorsville when he's wounded. They both go down. He's in the ambulance. When Jackson's brought to the ambulance, he realizes that Crutchfield's in worse shape than he is, and he gives up his spot. And that's the family lore. He gives up his spot. I'm pretty sure he was going to give it up whether or not he wanted to, right? But the family legend is that he gives up his spot for Jackson to ride in the ambulance. Rogers is best known for, he recovers in Richmond, but he is the one that designs the 3rd Confederate national flag by being very complicated and just adding that red stripe on the white flag, right? But he's the one that wins the contest. They have a contest in the winter of 1864-65 to redesign the Confederate national flag because obviously, as you all know, it has a real big white field and the wind doesn't catch it. Looks like a flag of surrender. So Rogers comes up with this great idea that actually wins this competition of just adding that red stripe on the end of it. And that flag is approved by the Confederate Congress in March of 1865, which obviously, as we know, not many were made. Actually, I don't believe any were made. There's some arguments about if any of those flags were made. But he's an interesting character to follow and how he ties back into the war. But he's there that evening. And the family legend, as I taught when I was a young kid, was he gave up his spot for Jackson, which he probably did. But as I say, he probably was going to have to do that whether he was so inclined or not.
Glad to see the Confederates were so focused in March of 1865 on the important things.
I tell you what, hey, bureaucracy.
They needed the white flags at that point. They didn't need
bureaucracy. Hey, government bureaucracy will not end, right? No matter what's going on in the battlefield.
Kicking and screaming.
I've contended that Jackson's wounding at this moment is probably the best thing that could happen to Lee in the Battle of Chancellorsville. And that's kind of a provocative thing to say, I think. But had he survived, and a lot of people like to do this armchair generaling, as Kris and Robert both pointed out, there are significant obstacles that are still on the battlefield that he and his corps are ill-equipped to handle at this point in the fight. And so really by taking a pause at this moment, Jeb Stuart is going to come in and take over because both of Jackson's other division commanders, Riley Colson and Robert roads, too inexperienced. It's the first time at division command for both of them. So Stewart's going to come in and take over. And he's really going to reshuffle the deck, and he's not going to push on to U.S. forward as Jackson had wanted to. That would have taken him farther away from Robert E. Lee. Instead, he's going to try to reunite with Lee and reconnect, and then allow Lee to kind of call the shots from there.
Yeah, because I mean, at this point, if Jackson is still in command and Hill's still in command, he's going against 5 full divisions of fresh Union troops just between the 1st and 5th Corps alone. 5th Corps, only one of its divisions was heavily engaged on the 1st, so the other 2 are fresh. The 1st Corps did a hell of a lot of marching and very little fighting during this campaign. They actually sustained less than 200 casualties during the entire Chancellorsville campaign. So there you go, right there alone. Hill's 12,000 men now have to take on 2 essentially fresh corps, and then again, not to mention the other corps that I had mentioned earlier.
So Jackson's going to end up dying of complications related to his wounding. That'll happen on May 10th, 1863. For some people, the war ends that day, as we talked about. But the real Battle of Chancellorsville starts the morning of May 3rd, and the casualties really get going. Second bloodiest day in American history. Let's keep the focus here on Jackson as we start to wrap up, fellas. Rob, what's your assessment of Jackson at Chancellorsville? Your final assessment.
At Chancellorsville, wow. I think if we're going to give a grade, I'd give a B minus maybe. And I think a lot of that is my own, background reading about this since I was a kid, probably tainting that. It's probably worse of a grade. But, when you read Civil War history as a kid, especially in the 80s, and, you get this, this vision of him and how he's performing at Chancellorsville. I do think that if it wasn't for Jackson, I don't know who Lee would have given this mission to, right? As Kris said, Longstreet's not there. I don't know who Jackson would have trusted to do this maneuver, if Jackson was not around. But yeah, I mean, I think he does. It's a lot of things are working against him as far as the timing goes, and I'm not. It's hard to blame him for that. But even if he was successful and surviving, not getting wounded, as Kris said, I think it would have not gone well for him the very next day, especially if he kept with his plan. Of course, we don't know if he would have kept with his plan, but I'd give him a B minus.
A B minus. See, and I think that's a generous grade. I think like for getting yourself shot, you get the automatic F, but that's.
Well, I mean, good point.
You spent too much time with me.
Kris, what's your assessment of Jackson at Chancellorsville?
I think the first day he did well. On April 29th, when at first he wants to become aggressive, then realizes with Lee that Sedgwick's men below Fredericksburg were not so much of a threat. I think he reacted there well. He led his men well on the first day. I think that Hooker took victory from the jaws of defeat. Or defeat from the jaws of victory there, because he outflanked Jackson's men. He had more men than Jackson did, but Jackson's aggression is what's going to knock Hooker off kilter. So I think he did well there. But once you get into the flank march and once you get into his subsequent wounding, he was slow on the march. Yeah, he rolled up the 11th Corps. But by the time he is wounded, he shouldn't have been wounded, because that's, again, his own damn fault for riding out like he did. He should never have done that. He should have sent lieutenants out there. He had plenty of staff officers on hand. That shows just a lack of trust, and I think also goes to a whole nother story of how incompetent I think some of the Confederate staff officers actually were at the upper echelons of the Army Command of Army Northern Virginia. I think they had great commanders, but I think some of their command staff were just terrible. And then you have Jackson coming up with this attack towards United States Ford. I don't think he understood what was in front of him. I don't think he understood the layout of the enemy. I don't think he understood anything. So I think if you're going to go with April 29th, I give him an A. If you're going with May 1st, I give him a solid B. And if you're going with May 2nd, I give him a D minus, because it's just, you've got Lee on one side, you've got a leaderless Second Corps on the other side, and you've got an enraged Army of the Potomac in the middle of them. And then of course, he got himself shot. I don't blame John Barry, because John Barry's the
Oh, yeah.
The 18th North Carolina gives the order to shoot Jackson. He doesn't know it's Jackson. He's reacting in the moment, in the spot. People ask often, why didn't they hang him? Why didn't they shoot him? John Barry will eventually become a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He did nothing wrong. He was not culpable. Jackson, and that just shows that Jackson was in the wrong. Mind you, his commanding officer, Thomas Purdy, is going to be chewed out left and right to the point that Purdy gets himself killed the next day on May the 3rd to try to make up for his men shooting Jackson on the evening of May 2nd.
So D-. That's like, I'm going to ruin your GPA, but I don't want to see you again next semester, so I'm going to pass you.
If you average all those grades out, it's basically a C, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically a C.
We've given folks lots to think about tonight. I just want to ask you guys real quickly before we wrap up, any final thoughts you want to impart on folks before we wrap up our discussion?
I'll go real quick, 'cause I know Kris has got probably more to say about Chancellorsville. I'm just going to say that I think when you look at Jackson's career leading up to this point, he's got great moments, but he has also really low moments. And that's what makes him such a interesting figure to debate. And, you know, I do believe, kind of like what you said at the beginning, you know, he died at his apex, which if you want to be remembered throughout time as a hero, that's the time to do it. You know, he had lots of faults, but a lot of those faults go away in the post-war era when they're talking about Jackson, you know, and lost cause theory there. You know, if you study him today, I think he's great in campaign strategy, but on the battlefield itself, he doesn't really show himself all that great many different times. But he was aggressive, and that's why Lee liked him.
Yeah. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than be good. And I think there was a lot of luck in Stonewall Jackson for a long time. You know, who he was fighting against. I often tell people, you know, kind of like what Rob was saying, go back into 1863 and look at him in the lens of 1863. Don't look at him in 2020, because what happens is you get that 2020 vision of Jubal Early and others saying just how spectacular he was. And he had his great moments, as Rob said, but I'm more fascinated by Robert E. Lee. When Robert E. Lee loses his temper, everyone's like, oh, you know, he's reverent, he does this, he's so nice. No, he had a great temper on him, and nobody wanted to make Lee mad. It's kind of like George Washington. That's the side of Lee I love to talk about, to hear about, the human side of him. And to understand Jackson's command, you have to understand the man. Going back to his childhood, as I said, he has a lot of trust issues, which carry up into the battlefield. Whenever you're in 1862, look at who he's fighting against. You know, when he loses the Battle of Kernstown, he loses against a West Point graduate. When you go to the Valley Campaign of 1862, which is a brilliant marching campaign, normally he outnumbers his opponent, and he's not fighting a West Point trained officer. You know, he's fighting B-list generals throughout a lot of it. Once he starts to get into the A-list down there in the 7 days, he does not perform well. He almost loses, as Rob said, to Banks up at Cedar Mountain, and then moves up to Second Manassas, where he really has a great battle. He has a great battle at Antietam. He's terrible on the defensive at Fredericksburg. And then here you are at Chancellorsville, where, you know, a lot of people say, oh, you know, this was his greatest moment. No, it wasn't, because the next day it's going to cost the Army of Northern Virginia nearly 10,000 casualties just to put that army back together. So if you're going to say, oh, well, look what Jackson did the day before. Yeah, but look what happens the next day when they have to try to destroy Hooker's army. They're going to lose over 10,000 men that next day. And by the end of the battle, Lee's army is so ravaged that they can't coordinate. They can't fight anymore. And Lee, that temper comes out. And, you know, E.P. Alexander or Dorsey Pender, I can't remember which one, said on May the 5th that the old man was in a wicked mood today because they could not land the killing blow like Rob said they wanted to do at Fredericksburg and other places. So take the time to look at these guys. And you know, the last thing I'll say is one of my favorite comments about the Longstreet and Jackson, you know, whose side are you on, came from a staff ride last year whenever somebody said, you know what, it's like Biggie and Tupac when you got Longstreet versus Jackson. And that's how I look at it.
That's awesome.
And I have nothing to add to that comparison. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Rob Orrison, Kris White, thank you both for a very entertaining discussion this evening. I'm Kris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.